The North Atlantic is a cold and merciless place. For weeks at a time, the sea looks endless. Gray waves, bitter wind, and fog that hides everything beyond a few ship lengths. Through that vast emptiness, Viking longships pushed westward. Their carved dragon heads rose and fell with each wave, slicing through the mist like silent hunters. These ships carried men and women from Greenland, people who had already settled the harsh edges of the known world. They were not explorers in search of fame. They were farmers, carpenters, and sailors searching for survival. Greenland's land was rocky, the soil thin, and every tree precious. Without timber, they could not build houses or repair their ships. Without ships, they were trapped. For generations, stories had circulated among the Greenlanders. Sailors returning from fishing trips spoke of a distant coastline far to the west, a place where forests stretched endlessly, where rivers teemed with fish, and where the air smelled of pine. It sounded like a dream, but for those living on the edge of starvation, it was a dream worth chasing. So one season after another, their eyes turned toward the unknown sea. It was a dangerous idea. The North Atlantic is unpredictable, full of sudden storms, drifting ice, and hidden reefs. Yet for the Norse, the sea was not a barrier. It was a highway. Their ancestors had already conquered the North Sea, settled Iceland, and crossed to Greenland. One more leap west did not seem impossible. In the late 10th century, the great explorer Eric the Red had led settlers to Greenland after being banished from Iceland. His new colony barely survived. Winters were long, food was scarce, and the farms depended on imported wood and iron from Europe. When his children, Leif, Thorvald, and Freydis, grew up, they inherited both his courage and his desperation. Leif, the eldest, listened closely to sailors' stories. Some claimed that a merchant blown off course had seen land far to the west. Others spoke of drifting logs and foreign seeds washing up on Greenland's shores, carried by ocean currents. These were signs, proof that another coast existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Life in Greenland was hard. The settlement, only a few hundred people strong, lived constantly at risk. One bad harvest or an especially cold year could bring hunger and death. Every piece of timber, every plank or beam was priceless. Without trees of their own, the Greenlanders relied on trade with Norway and Iceland. But those voyages were long and dangerous. A closer source of wood could mean the difference between survival and collapse. For the Vikings, exploration was as much about need as curiosity. They did not explore for maps or glory. They explored because they had to, because their survival demanded it. By the end of the 10th century, the dream of that western land had grown too strong to ignore. Somewhere beyond the icy horizon, there was a place of warmth and plenty, a place where rivers ran through deep forests, and where iron and timber were free for the taking. The Greenlanders prepared. They repaired ships, gathered supplies, and waited for the summer winds to turn favorable. Families whispered about leaving, not just to visit, but to build a new home, one beyond the edge of everything they knew. From these harsh beginnings, the first chapter of Vinland began. A journey born from cold, hunger, and hope would soon carry the Vikings farther than any European had ever gone before. But the land they were about to find was not empty. From the shadows of its forests, unseen eyes were already watching. The eyes of people who had lived there for thousands of years, people who would soon face the strange sails of the north across their horizon. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, decided to chase the rumors that had filled his childhood. He had grown up hearing sailors talk about a distant western land covered in forests. Some said they had glimpsed its shores by accident. Others had found driftwood that could not have come from anywhere near Greenland. The stories were too many to ignore. Leif was not a reckless adventurer. He was a practical man. Greenland was struggling, short of food, short of timber, short of everything that made survival possible. If the stories were true, this new land could save his people. He bought a strong ship, a nar, a merchant vessel built for long-distance sailing. Then he gathered a small crew of about 35 men and women. They loaded the ship with supplies, dried fish, tools, axes, and livestock for food. In the summer, when the seas were calmer, they set out from Greenland, following the ocean currents to the southwest. The voyage was long and dangerous. The sea was rough, and storms often swept in without warning. The crew endured days of fog and freezing spray, their wooden ship creaking under the strain of the waves. Food and water were rationed, yet despite the hardship, they pressed on. After many days, the air began to change. The biting smell of ice and salt faded. In its place came a softer scent, the smell of trees and soil. To men who had lived their whole lives in a treeless world, it was almost magical. It meant land was near. Then one gray morning they saw it. A coastline rose out of the mist, wide and green, lined with forests that stretched endlessly inland. Rivers glimmered like silver in the sunlight, and birds circled overhead. For the first time, the Norse had reached the North American continent. They sailed along the coast, exploring bays and headlands. The land seemed untouched and rich beyond imagination. There was grass for livestock, timber for building, and streams full of salmon. They built small sod-walled shelters, simple houses half buried in the earth to keep out the cold. This camp would later be known as Leifsbudir, Life's houses. The Norse called the region Vinland, the land of wine. The sagas say wild grapes grew there, though modern historians believe the name may have come from the abundance of berries or fertile soil. Whatever its true meaning, to the Vikings it represented abundance, a world of possibility. They stayed through the winter. The land was mild compared to Greenland, and game was plentiful. They hunted, fished, and explored, but despite the beauty and resources around them, they saw no people. The forests were silent except for the sounds of animals and wind. When spring came, Leif ordered his ship loaded with timber, furs, and anything valuable they could carry. They had found what they came for: wood, food, and proof that the stories were true. Without a single man lost, Leif and his crew turned their sails back toward Greenland. When they arrived home, their news caused a sensation. They spoke of a place far richer than their frozen colony, a land of forests, fresh water, and fertile soil. Leif's voyage was a success. He had discovered a new world and returned safely. But his discovery would not remain peaceful for long. Word spread quickly through Greenland and Iceland. More people wanted to go, not just to explore, but to settle, to claim this rich land for themselves. The next expedition would be larger, bolder, and far more dangerous. And it would bring with it the first meeting and the first conflict between the Norse and the native peoples of North America. A few years after Leif Erikson's peaceful return, word of his discovery spread across the Norse world. The stories of Vinland, its green forests, rich soil, and endless rivers, captured everyone's imagination. In Greenland, where each tree was worth its weight in gold, such a land sounded like a miracle. One man in particular was determined to go there. His name was Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic merchant and sailor. He was wealthy, ambitious, and far more organized than Leif had been. Karlsefni didn't just want to explore. He wanted to build a settlement. In the year 1006 AD, Karlsefni assembled an expedition of about 160 settlers, men, women, and children. They brought livestock, tools, and even a few cows and pigs. Among them was Karlsefni's wife, Gudrid, who was heavily pregnant. They left Greenland in 3 ships, retracing Leif's route across the open ocean. After weeks at sea, they reached the same broad coastline Leif had found. They followed it south until they came to a sheltered spot near a river mouth. There they built a small palisaded village with longhouses and storage sheds. This site, archaeologists believe, was near what we now call L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. For a time, the colony thrived. The settlers fished, hunted, and gathered wood. The soil was rich and the climate was milder than Greenland's. The Norse finally had what they had dreamed of, a second chance at a new life. But this time, the land was not silent. Not far from the settlement lived people who had been there for generations, likely the Beothuk, or Mi'kmaq, native tribes of the region. Skilled hunters and traders, they watched the newcomers with interest and caution. At first, there was trade. The Vikings and the natives exchanged goods, furs and food for iron tools, colored cloth, and milk from the settlers' cows. To both sides, it was something entirely new. The Norse had never met people like these, and the natives had never seen iron weapons or red fabric that shone like fire. Trade was tense but peaceful. Both sides were careful, moving slowly and keeping weapons in view. But beneath the surface, fear and misunderstanding grew. The Vikings thought of the natives as primitive and weak. They even gave them a name, Skraelings, which roughly meant wretches or thin people. To the Norse, it was a word of contempt. For the natives, the Norse must have seemed strange and threatening. Their iron blades cut through wood like nothing they had ever seen. Their axes, armor, and animals were alien. And their habits, shouting loudly, cutting trees, fencing land, violated the quiet balance of the forest and sea. The tension finally broke because of a bull. One morning, a large bull belonging to the settlers escaped from its pen. It charged wildly through a nearby native camp, trampling belongings and killing a dog. To the settlers, it was an accident. To the natives, it was an attack, an insult that demanded revenge. Days later, revenge came. At sunrise, 30 canoes glided silently through the mist. The native warriors came fast, their paddles flashing in the water. Without warning, a storm of arrows fell on the Viking settlement. The Norse scrambled to defend themselves. Shields locked together, they formed a wall of wood and iron. The phalanx, the same tactic that had brought them victory in Europe. The arrows thudded against shields and armor, some finding gaps, others bouncing off. The fight was quick and violent. The natives withdrew, leaving several canoes behind. The Norse had survived, but the message was clear. Peace was over. That first battle was only the beginning. The fragile trust between the two peoples had shattered. Scouts from both sides began moving through the forest. The Norse built higher walls, posted guards, and repaired their weapons. Soon after, another group of natives was spotted near the settlement. 9 men, likely scouts watching from a distance. The settlers' leader, Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, led a group of armed men to confront them. The Norse fell upon the sleeping scouts at dawn, killing 8. But one escaped and fired a single arrow in return. That arrow found its mark. It struck Thorvald beneath the arm, piercing his chest. He was carried back to camp, mortally wounded. Knowing he would not survive, he asked to be buried there, in the new land they had fought for. Thorvald Eriksson became the first European to die on North American soil. His grave, marked with simple crosses, became a symbol of both courage and futility. A man who found a rich country, but not the peace to live in it. From that day on, the settlers lived in constant fear. The forest, once full of promise, now seemed full of eyes. Every shadow might hide an enemy. Every ripple in the water might mark a canoe. The first war between Europeans and the peoples of America had begun, not out of greed or conquest, but from fear, misunderstanding, and pride. The death of Thorvald Eriksson changed everything. The settlers at Vinland no longer felt safe. Every sound in the forest became a warning. Every shift in the wind felt like a threat. The dream of a peaceful colony had turned into a daily struggle for survival. The Skraelings, the native peoples of the region, had lost patience. They no longer approached in peace. They no longer came to trade. Instead, they came to drive the settlers away, and they fought with skill and intelligence. The Skraelings knew their land. They moved quietly through the trees, paddled swiftly, across the rivers, and used the dense forests as both shield and weapon. Their attacks were sudden, precise, and terrifying. They struck without warning, disappearing before the Norse could organize a counterattack. The Vikings, for all their strength and weapons, were not used to this kind of war. In Europe, they fought in open fields or along coasts where ships and formations gave them power. Here, their heavy armor and close formations slowed them down. The forests were too thick, the ground too rough, and the enemy too fast. The Norse still held one advantage: iron. Their swords and axes could cut through shields and spears with ease. But they were few in number, and every wound, every loss weakened their small community. One day the Skraelings returned in force. They came at dawn in dozens of canoes, their paddles flashing in rhythm across the water. When they reached the shallows, arrows rained down on the Viking settlement. The sound of the attack filled the air. The hiss of arrows, the cries of wounded men, the pounding of shields. The settlers formed a defensive wall. They had built their fort well, with wooden palisades and narrow openings for archers. For a time, the Norse held firm. Their shields locked and their axes struck back. But the attacks did not stop. Each day brought new raids, small groups testing the defenses, probing for weakness. The Vikings were trapped in a cycle of exhaustion. They could not rest, could not hunt, could not cut timber without fear of ambush. Their advantage in open battle meant little when the enemy never fought on their terms. The sagas tell of one strange and terrifying moment. In one attack, the native warriors carried a large, dark blue object mounted on a pole. As they approached the Norse fort, they spun it, and it made a deep roaring sound, a sound unlike anything the settlers had ever heard. The noise rolled across the field like thunder, echoing off the trees. It was a weapon of fear, a psychological tactic. Some believe it was a stretched animal bladder filled with stones or air, made to rattle and boom. Whatever it was, it worked. The Vikings hesitated. Many believed it was magic, a curse or a sign of angry gods. Their courage faltered. And then, in that moment of fear, a single figure stepped forward, Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red. She was heavily pregnant, yet she refused to hide. She picked up a fallen sword, raised it high and struck the flat of the blade against her chest. Then she screamed, a loud, fierce, defiant cry that echoed over the battlefield. The sight of a pregnant woman, wild-eyed and fearless, stunned everyone. The Norse, ashamed of their hesitation, roared back to life. They surged forward, swinging their axes and pushing the Skraelings back. The attackers, shocked by the outburst, retreated into the forest. That day, the Norse survived, but they knew it was only temporary. The war had become a battle of endurance, and the settlers were losing. As the months passed, the situation grew worse. The settlers could not farm safely, their livestock dwindled. The constant fear wore them down. They buried their dead quietly at night, hoping not to draw more attention. When archaeologists later uncovered the site of Lonso Meadows, they found evidence of burning, a thin layer of ash and charcoal buried beneath the soil. It was proof that someone had set fire to the buildings soon after they were built. Whether it was the Skraelings reclaiming their land, or the Vikings burning their own camp before leaving, the message was clear. Vinland would not be held. The settlers had come for wealth, wood, and a new home. Instead, they found war, fear, and loss. By the second year, the Viking settlement in Vinland was falling apart. The small community that had arrived with hope and determination now lived in fear. The forests that had once promised endless resources now hid their enemies. Every creak in the night, every rustle in the trees made hearts pound. Thorfinn Karlsefni, the leader of the expedition, knew the truth. They could not hold this land. When they had first arrived, there had been around 160 settlers. Now their numbers had dropped sharply. Illness, hunger, accidents, and battle had taken their toll. Fewer than 100 remained. Every day was a test of endurance. The settlers still had their iron weapons and sturdy walls, but they were outnumbered and isolated. Reinforcements were impossible. To return to Greenland meant sailing thousands of kilometers across a stormy ocean. Even if help could come, it would take years. They were alone. The Skraelings, the native people of the region, were relentless. Their attacks came without warning, quick and precise. Some days it was arrows fired from the edge of the forest. Other days it was canoes gliding silently toward the shore. They knew the land, the rivers, and the tides better than anyone. The settlers could fight them, but they could not stop them. The Norse tried to stay strong. They fought bravely whenever the enemy appeared. Their iron weapons were still deadly in close combat, but courage and skill could not overcome exhaustion and fear. The settlers grew weaker with every passing month. Then one morning, the war came to an unexpected end. As the Vikings stood watch from behind their palisade, a single canoe appeared. A native warrior paddled toward the shore. When he was close enough to be heard, he stopped, stood, and raised something in his hand. It was a Viking sword, one of their own. Without a word, he threw it onto the beach. The blade flashed in the sunlight and landed in the sand. Then he turned and paddled away. To the Vikings, the message was clear. It was not an offering or a surrender. It was a warning. The sword, their greatest symbol of power, had been taken and returned, to show that even iron meant nothing here. The land belonged to its original people, and they intended to keep it that way. Karlsefni gathered his remaining followers. He looked around at the tired faces of his men and women, at the wounded, at the graves near the fort, and at his wife, Gudrid, who had given birth to their son, Snorri, the first known European child born in North America. He knew they had to leave. The sagas record his final decision in a few simple words. Although the land is good, we will always live in fear of those who dwell here. It was the end. The settlers packed what little they could carry, the remaining livestock, barrels of food, and the precious timber they had cut under constant attack. The last longships were pushed back into the water. As their sails filled with wind, the Norse turned their faces toward home. On the shore, the Skraelings watched silently. There were no cheers, no pursuit. They had won by endurance, not by conquest. The invaders were gone. The voyage back to Greenland was long and harsh. Some ships likely never made it. Those who did carried stories of a beautiful but dangerous world, a place where courage was not enough, and where the land itself seemed to resist them. The attempt to colonize Vinland had lasted only 3 short years. After that, no Norse expedition ever returned to settle again. For the next 4 centuries, the continent remained untouched by Europe's expansion. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins at Lens aux Meadows in the 20th century, they found proof of this forgotten chapter. Charred wood, broken tools, iron nails, and arrowheads lying side by side. 2 worlds had met there, and both had walked away scarred. The Norse had come seeking life, but they found death and resistance. The native peoples, the true owners of the land, had defended their home and won. The sagas remembered the courage of explorers like Leif, Thorvald, and Freydis. But the greater victory belonged to the unseen warriors of the forest and sea, those who refused to yield their world to strangers. Today, the wind still blows across the grassy hills of Lens aux Meadows. The outlines of old Viking houses can still be seen, and the sea still crashes against the rocks where their ships once landed. The place is quiet now, but the silence carries a story. It is the story of the first European settlement in North America, and of its fall. Story of courage and conflict, of hope and loss, and above all, a reminder that not every land welcomes conquest.